Good afternoon, everyone. As we said after the coffee break, between coffee and lunch is always a difficult time, so I'll try to keep this as lively as I can. And really our topic today is to talk about what does best performance look like in global business services today, and where is it going by 2020, which is where I'll end up in this presentation. So first, what you always need to know whenever someone's going to show you data is, where did the data come from? How good is the data set that it comes from? And the Hackett Group, for those of you that don't know, has been doing benchmarking since 1992 across sales, general, and administrative expense with a focus on global business services. Matter of fact, we run a global business services survey every year to the top 200 GBS organizations to look at what's the composition of their services, how are they delivering them, what kind of satisfaction levels are they getting from that, and where are they going next. So you're going to see some of those highlights today. But I also wanted to point out that part of Hackett's mission in doing benchmarking and then consulting to work with clients to actually implement that, and then the service that I run, which is the advisory practice, is helping clients to chart their path on where do they want to go. Is it more about productivity and efficiency, or is it more about extending the services they have, extending the GBS brand, going to a more mature GBS organizational model? And those are all choices that all of you in the audience have, and hopefully some of the frameworks we'll show today will help you through the rest of this conference to make some of those decisions and weigh the trade-offs of various ways that you might go. One of the things that I heard mentioned in the survey was around talent. And we too, every time we study, see talent as a top 3 issue, if not number 1. And that's why we partnered with the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, CIMA, to launch a GBS training curriculum. Not because we thought commercially was the first place we were going to go. It's because all of you were telling us, how do we embed and get better skills in the people that we have? And it's a critical component, again, as you start to think about how do I extend the value proposition of my GBS, is how do I extend, again, the talent and the skills to make them better business partners in those GBS organizations. So, a little bit of our data, and again, our data will look a little bit different than some that you've seen from ABSL in their studies because it's more narrowly aligned to just HR, finance, IT, and procurement, which are the core functions that Hackett really studies and does most of our work in. But if you look at of centers operating globally, the shared services and BPO distribution as of 2016 in Hackett's database, and again, that database has over 20,000 data points, so this is a very broad, very deep database. 70% are in captive shared services, about 30% are in BPO organizations, so about 6,000 overall. The regional distribution is, again, about 50% Europe, and the other 45 you could say is between the Americas, North America, South America, and then and also in, again, Asia Pacific. So just the split that we have of the shared services and BPOs. The good news for all of you sitting here, and of course that message has been loud and clear, is the attractiveness is Poland as a destination. Number 2 of top 5 global destinations with BPOs in terms of the number of centers those BPOs have that we're tracking. And number 3 in terms of top 5 global destinations with shared services, captive shared service centers. And rapidly approaching and will most likely overtake the UK in the next year or two, particularly given if Brexit goes the way it's going to. Will probably have a pretty major impact on the UK in terms of its ability to have shared service centers. So the question we're always asked is, are global business services taking over the majority of business support functions? And I use this slide quite a bit with business audiences, because your stakeholders, one of their fears is, well, gee, you keep on talking about taking over more and more. What will we do as the function? What will the finance function do going forward? What will the HR function do? And I think the point is that you need to change the conversation. It really should be much more about, it may be a real fear, but our job is to change the conversation to one around outperformance. How are we producing value for the organization to allow it to do a better job reaching its goals? And the first part of this is really what has been tracked by Hackett for the last roughly 15 years in our GBS study, again, of over 200 shared service centers a year. World-class, those top kind of 15% of the companies in our database tend to, on average, their savings profile over baseline savings in year 2, so not year 1 when you're transitioning work, but year 2 after you've stabilized it in the GBS, is around 35%. That's one of the reasons why when you look at SG&A business cases about transformation, which is what this conference is all about, from an SG&A executive standpoint, GBS is still, if not a top 3, a top 5 initiative across SG&A. in terms of its ability to provide cost savings and greater productivity for the organization. The peer is only about 20%. Now, 20% is still pretty good for most business cases that I've seen. So no matter what, even if you're not doing it that well, moving work into a low-cost location, expanding out the spans of control, you are going to save money going into GBS. So it's a fantastic message. A lot of our GBS center leaders love to use this when talking about why should you be giving me more scope. And it's because the first thing that you're going to be able to do is hopefully save money going into the center. I think the more difficult conversation, though, and this is where the world class really tend to shine, is the ability over time to pull out additional savings. And this takes, again, a completely different operating model that the world class operate in versus the average shared service centers. 8% versus pure at 5%, then that 8% actually has gone down from world class in years past, has been 10 to 13%. It went down in this year's study primarily because the world class, as you heard earlier from some of the speakers, is caring less and less about how much, where are we spending our time, and more of it's being devoted on how do I provide more value to the business, and the cost equation, or the cost reduction, if you will, year over year is becoming less important to most businesses. So let's look at the other side of the coin, and this is again where when you look forward we see GBS as really being successful, which is world-class or effective or highly effective at delivering a high-quality services portfolio. And that's as judged by their customer satisfaction surveys, their 360 surveys of their teams, looking at quality statistics in our database. Again, it is an imperative if you're going to climb up the curve that you deliver high-quality services. Only about half the peer group does that. Let's see if the clicker still works here. Here we go. So 93% are rated as effective or highly effective at delivering against customer intimacy goals. So this is a newer one. It's not enough to say high quality, because you may be delivering high quality in terms of invoice error rates when your end customers or stakeholders don't care about that anymore. They said, look, I met with one CFO who said, I used to really care about close cycle time. When you get below 3 days, it really doesn't matter to me because the business isn't asking for me to go any faster. So me tracking that metric is useless to my end stakeholders. What is very important, though, is the explains I have month after month and becoming not just historically what's going on with the close and what does that mean, but based on what we've seen over the last 6 months, these are the trends that we believe the business should care about. I said my team's spending more time on that, and the more support I can get from the GBS team in financial accounting to do that for the controllers is what will really provide value to me, and that's what it means delivering against customer intimacy goals. And then finally, talking about agility. So this is the responsiveness piece. And when I talk about agility, it really comes down to time to make a change. How long does it take when someone comes to you, and a business leader comes to you and says, look, I've got an acquisition coming up. How quickly can you integrate the pieces of that acquisition that could go into the GBS model? Is it 9 months? Is it 6 months? Well, hopefully in most businesses, if you're going to be world class, it's 3 months or less. So that's what it means to be world-class or effective or highly effective in contributing to enterprise agility. Moving work in, moving that work to a global location from regional centers, or in some cases moving it back out because that's the best thing for the business, or maybe if you're doing some kind of divestiture. So of everything in this presentation, this is probably the one slide that I'd say I would hope would be the most successful to all of you. So we heard this morning that GBS, the value proposition is changing. That value proposition, again, and historically, and I think there was one slide I love, kind of corporate rats or something on those lines versus the coffee shop stories. It was a great slide, and really stage one talks to that where most of your centers have started, which is functionally focused, regional shared services, you're consolidating scope, you're looking at really cost reduction, and it's really around single function consolidation. Today in our database, again, of over 200 GBSs that we study worldwide, 50% of those are in stage one still. They may have, and when I say that, that may be HR, it might be manufacturing, logistics, supply chain, but they each have their own dominant silo. By 2020, that should only be about a third of the centers are moving away from that kind of siloed shared services model. Stage two, which is where most companies are trying to get to on a multifunction GBS, and this is now climbing the value curve, is it starts with end-to-end process orientation. So how do we extend the wings of what was an accounts payable process to a buy to pay and ultimately to source to settle, and really starting to put some of those category managers even inside the GBS, as opposed to doing that outside in a joint kind of procurement and finance process as an example. Global process ownership. So who's going to call the ball? Who has decision rights over how this process looks? It's one of the biggest impediments to a GBS transferring and migrating work and then running it successfully is if you can't get a uniform standard agreed to by your stakeholders, it's very difficult to transfer that work and deliver on the value proposition of the GBS organization. Is it an integrated infrastructure hybrid center model? So who owns it? Do I have to own all the work, or can I just supply the infrastructure and basically have the functions still own some of those resources internally? What I say is, again, as you go to as a service model, as was talked about later, or earlier, excuse me, that's less important. What's more important is can I drive value for that process in a way that the function and the business will support? Service management. So again, this is about demand management, supply management, migration management, having a playbook of how do I migrate work in. Catalog center management, so how do I put catalogs together that reflect the services that I provide at the cost. I think one of the key learnings there is when you're going to be doing reporting and analytics on those processes and reporting it back to the business, the companies that tend to do this well look at input and output metrics, because that allows you to better control the conversation to say, as a service provider, the best I can do right now with the input metrics that you're giving me from the business is this. If you change the inputs, then I can do something better. If you don't have that, then the blame all falls to the shared service center, and it slows you down from, again, getting more work and kind of coming up the curve. Knowledge centers of expertise are a piece of it, where you're picking up knowledge centers, and I think particularly in the case of process robotics, this is going to become more and more important for Poland centers, or really to have a hybrid model. It's not just about transactional work, it's about knowledge-based work. And as time goes on, knowledge-based work will become the focus, frankly, for many of your centers, as RPA takes out a lot of the repetitive, routine tasks. But I will say that the process robotics, at least in terms of Hackett's data and our performance study we did, is still more in the hype cycle than it is reality at this point. So the data that we have, not in my slides because it's brand new, but the data that we have on RPA shows that for companies outside of some industry-specific tasks, like let's say claims processing in the insurance industry, is only around 10% of the companies that have shared services are currently investing in RPA, less than 10%. Now the planned investment over the next 2 to 3 years is 33%. So we're at the front end of the cycle. There's a lot of unknowns. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but all of you in this room need to think about the model in terms of where do you provide value, and because someone's going to need to manage those robots. So at our best practices conference in Chicago, we had Delphi talk about the toughest thing for them was trying to find the people that are actually going to program the robots, those scripts that would automate tasks across between multiple systems, and then monitor those over time. Those are going to be your people. So who are going to be managing and programming the robots and changing up their decision criteria? And then finally, BPO and managed services comes into it. As a service, again, it doesn't matter at the end of the day whether you have it hosted directly or you're using an outsourced provider to provide, or a third party to provide those services. The stakeholders in your business doesn't care. That's really stage 2 in multifunction, again going from 41% up to 48%, about 50% or half by 2020 will be in stage 2. Stage 3, now you're getting into integrated business services. And this is where you get into as a service. So you go from end-to-end process to looking at a collection of services that processes sit behind. Now only, again, about 9% are there today. That'll be going up to around 15% by 2020. But here you're looking at revenue-enabling knowledge centers of excellence. So one of the things, GE was a speaker at our Chicago conference this year and said that they delivered, again, tens of millions of dollars back to GE Medical by their ability to start taking on outbound call center tasks where they'd realign basically data scientists to work inside the GBS organization to mine GE Medical's, GE Healthcare's data basically, and look for opportunities, and then took on some of the outbound telemarketing to go back out to those business customers, and they were generating value from that. Now you can't do that on day one. That's the reason why there is this migration curve, but there's no way robots are taking that on anytime soon. And that's where the business gets really excited, when you can start to generate revenue for the business. And then finally, they become more innovation contributors in terms of how do I lead that conversation on things that can be done for the business, how do I provide total business value. So what you struggle against is the GBS operating model needs to be able to defy organizational gravity. Because as I've talked about rising up in the curve, there's a natural tendency for the business to want to exert a pull towards decentralization. Why can't we just pull it back in? Why can't we do it ourselves? So communication, great reporting in terms of what we're doing, is all important to be able to make that message stick. And how do you do that? It starts with a balanced operating model. So on the left, it shows for those companies that have a GBS organization that right now the average process scope of all the processes that might be in, about 43% is in the peer, almost 60% is in world-class. Which is why when companies ask me, what is the rough kind of guidance that you give across finance, HR, IT, procurement, it varies by function to a certain extent, but overall, 60% is a goal that most companies have in terms of all my process scope, what can be performed in a GBS shared services today versus what should be in the business or at corporate. That's about where the numbers are. So what's important and what's on the right? So every consultant that you'll talk to has some kind of pyramid, so I had to put a pyramid slide in. But what's important is this kind of wave structure of starting at the bottom of how do I contribute to business control, policy, compliance, getting up to scale, so providing more scale savings, location, understanding where I can maximize kind of value of the business's location versus the location of the centers, and really looking after cost savings, and then getting into more business agility, being able to save to invest. So the GBS organization is returning $30 or $50 or $100 million a year back to the business. It's being able to reinvest in R&D and sales and marketing efforts. And then finally looking at how do we support business outcome growth and generate experience basically for the business overall. What's on the left, again, in that GBS impact on value, that's actually from our clients. That is not Hackett's words. Those are our clients' words of what they have heard from their business leaders as to how GBS creates value. So think about how your own business leaders would describe your GBS center, your organization. And that'll tell you where you are on this list. So let's quickly talk about IT, finance, HR, procurement, and where they are. Again, IT is kind of leading the pack, the highest up. They've been doing kind of centralization in GBS the longest of the four functions. Around 70% of total business work is in some kind of GBS shared services. However, I will say that IT is also the most likely to kind of be on an island and do their own siloed shared services versus being in a multifunction model. Finance would be next up, around 60%, again with 43 at the peer, so there is a big difference in finance, but finance has been, I would say, slow and steady in terms of climbing up the evolution of the types of processes that are performed within finance. HR at 50% versus 33. In most organizations, HR is a huge growth area, because just like I heard from many of you in the break, that again, talent is a big concern for you, it's at least as big a concern, if not bigger, for the business. So what can you do to help enable that, to make it easier to, again, find, locate, track employees, bring them on board more quickly, take down basically the recruit and hire cycle from somewhere 90 to 120 days down to 30 to 45 days at the most. And most of that can be performed within a HR shared services environment. Procurement. This is the big growth area, 47% for world-class versus only 20% for the peer group. So this is where companies really differentiate themselves in procurement and saying, look, there is strategic procurement and there is transactional procurement. And at the very least, we better get transactional procurement in the GBS as quickly as possible. A lot of CPOs have been resistant to that, but the world-class have really hopped on board and said this is an area for real growth. Some of the other percentage of GBS and other functions, again, customer contact, inbound, order management, real estate facilities, supply chain services, legal all starting to come in. Environmental health and safety is another one that you see a lot of companies considering. So as you think about the GBS value proposition, what are these other processes that can really add value by putting them into a GBS organization? So let's talk about a couple key findings just to wrap up. The first one being cost leadership continues to be table stakes. So I talked about cost isn't as important, but if you can't at least deliver cost savings, you can't go any further. So no matter how high up you go, whether it's a stage 3 GBS organization or a stage 1, you've got to always have cost leadership. Vision, in terms of by 2020, more than 80% will have moved beyond single function. So how can you become that as a service provider, again, as opposed to a transactional shared service center? Delivery network, consolidation of global hub with limited regional spokes and BU-specific COE satellites. So I'd say for the most part, most of you or most of your organizations in this room have moved beyond regional hubs to a global with regionals. The piece that's still out there that's not as well defined is around specific COE satellites and centers of expertise or excellence becoming part of the GBS model. Matter of fact, I've had several CFOs tell me, well, in my mind, that the COE concept, particularly when it's business-owned, really becomes a shell game, where the business will move scope into a COE and say it's business-owned, just as another way of keeping it from going into a GBS model. My turnaround to them is, if your GBS is really doing a good job, the business should be asking you to take on more of those knowledge-based processes. And you see that in those stage 2 and stage 3 companies, is that the business leaders are coming to the table saying, what can you do to help me make my numbers next year? Everything is on the table. The rise of the hybrid integrated infrastructure GBS model. So again, this is the tenant-landlord model where we're doing some of the processing work on captive within the business, some of that's owned by the GBS, some of it's still retained by the function, but they're using your scope and scale, which helps you in terms of your facilities costs, in terms of some of your management costs, to spread those better. So that's really the integrated model that companies are moving to. Outside-in customer-centric solution design. So we talked a lot, and you're going to hear about this in the next panel discussion about disruption and digitization. We'll get there in just a second. But what comes before that? Because you don't do digital transformation just for transformation's sake. You do digital transformation because that's what your end customers, that's what your stakeholders are asking for, that's what your vendors are looking for. But I would hazard a guess, when I talk to most customers about customer experience, they say, well, that's something that the business does. Absolutely, the GBS needs to start doing that. The company that's presented at some of our conferences is Coca-Cola, and their HR organization has really taken a lot of those service management processes to heart in terms of going out and saying, would you rather have this on mobile, or is this something you'd still rather do on your laptop? Is this something that is better automated, or is it really not worth the time and expense? What do you find in the process that's valuable versus not? Really getting under that before you're doing the solution design efforts, before you start saying what technology should we have, it gets back to kind of user requirements, to use an IT term. Virtually 100% of world-class GBS utilize global process ownership to manage end-to-end processes. I say virtually because pretty much the last 3 years we've run this study, it's between 94 and 100% of all world-class GBSs have global process ownership. That doesn't mean they have to sit inside the GBS, but they have to be somewhere with clear, again, decision rights on how do you make decisions around technology, process, the people, and so forth. Leading GBSs have cloud, mobile, and RPA solutions on their IT roadmaps. So it's not one or the other, it's all. It's about how do we move more of our infrastructure to the cloud. You'll hear companies that are saying that they have a target for 60 to 80% of their total applications to be hosted in the cloud within the next 3 years. It asks, do all of your organizations have that? Because most of the world class have a target in terms of how much can we get cloud enabled that allows us better scale, allows us to more quickly set up our shared service centers. Mobile, of course, is how companies and how especially the younger generations want to do business. So how do we move more of that reporting and analytics into mobile solutions? And then RPA, as we've talked about before. And finally, integrating centers of excellence in the GBS model becomes critical to accelerating GBS adoption. This is the future of where you're going. The top half of that stage model is all in center of expertise, excellence processes. So how do you make that, as opposed to an exception, the rule in terms of how you look at processes, that you're really looking for those knowledge-based processes? You'll do transactional, but the real value for the business is on the knowledge-based side. And then finally, none of that works, as we've heard before, if you don't have the right talent in place. And think about all the things I mentioned around process ownership, process standardization, customer experience mapping, journey mapping. These are things that aren't taught in any of the functions, and frankly aren't taught in business schools today or in undergrads. So if you're recruiting people, where are you going to find those skill sets from? That's really where the next generation is going to come from. How about programming robots? Where do you learn that? These are the skill sets, again, to start looking for in terms of becoming the true foundation. The world class invest up to 3 times as much in the training hours and the types of training that they provide to their employees. So I highly recommend that you look at your kind of the breadth of your GBS training talent management programs, and how do you expand those, not for what you have today, but where do you want to be in the next 3 years. So with that, I'll conclude. I know we've got a panel coming up next that we'll be talking about, again, the global 3D, which I think is a great kind of next step to what I've talked about here from the performance study that we conducted. I thank everyone for your participation. I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have. I'll be around for the full conference. Thank you very much.